Okay, get this. What if a book, written by someone who had never even set foot in the country it was about, could actually help end a war? Well, today we're diving into The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, a truly fascinating anthropological puzzle that was born right out of the chaos of World War II. So let's set the scene. It's 1944. The Pacific War is absolutely raging, and the United States is up against an enemy whose actions to them seem to defy all logic, costing thousands and thousands of lives.
Yeah, for the American military command, the behavior of Japanese soldiers wasn't just different, it was completely incomprehensible. It looked almost fanatical.
I mean, they were seeing soldiers making these banzai charges straight into machine gun fire. They saw civilians choosing death over being captured, and this near-total refusal to surrender no matter how hopeless things got. This wasn't just military tactics, it was a whole different mindset, a cultural code they just couldn't crack. And they absolutely had to crack it to answer one incredibly important question. The stakes here were just astronomical. An invasion of Japan could lead to millions of casualties on both sides. It would be a total bloodbath. So, to try and avoid that catastrophe, the US government turns to a very unlikely source for some answers. Right. They didn't call in another general or some top spy. Nope. They turned to a cultural anthropologist named Ruth Benedict, who was one of the sharpest minds in her field. But here's the catch, the huge challenge. It's the middle of a war. Benedict couldn't just hop on a plane to Japan, so she was given this almost impossible task: figure out an entire culture from the other side of the planet without ever going there. So what did she do? She basically became a cultural detective. She interviewed Japanese Americans, she devoured every book and article on Japan she could find, she even analyzed their movies, both propaganda and popular stuff, looking for all these hidden patterns and clues. And from thousands of miles away, she started to put together this cultural framework that would become her incredible book. And the title itself, the title is just perfect. It brilliantly captures this central contradiction she saw in the Japanese character. So let's break it down.
Okay, so on one side, you've got the chrysanthemum. Think of that beautiful, delicate flower. It represents a culture that deeply values beauty, art, and a very structured, peaceful, orderly society. It's even the crest of the emperor himself.
But then you have the sword, and that represents a fierce warrior spirit, a reverence for the military, for the samurai, and an embrace of aggression and violence.
So how can a single culture be both of these things at the same time? How can a people be so gentle, yet so aggressive? So polite and orderly, but also stubborn and resentful of control? Benedict argued that this duality wasn't a contradiction, it was the key, and she thought she had pinpointed the cultural engine that drove it all.
And this is where we get to her most famous, and frankly most controversial insight. She proposed this idea that Japan was fundamentally a shame culture, which stood in stark contrast to what she called the guilt culture of the West. So a guilt culture, which is how she described places like America, is all about your internal compass. Morality is something you feel on the inside. Your behavior is guided by your personal conscience, that little voice in your head that tells you what's right and wrong. A shame culture, on the other hand, is all about the external. It's not about your inner voice, it's about the eyes and judgments of your community. The main driver for good behavior is maintaining honor and avoiding public ridicule. It's all about what other people will think of you. Think of it like this. In a guilt culture, if you do something wrong and nobody finds out, it can still eat you up inside, right? You feel that guilt. But in a shame culture, if nobody finds out, then the negative consequence, the public shame, doesn't exist. The top priority is to hide the misdeed to protect your honor in the eyes of everyone else. Now, this insight was a total game changer for the war effort. It suggested that maybe, just maybe, a path to surrender that allowed Japan to avoid complete national shame, like, say, preserving the emperor's role, might actually work where threats of total annihilation had failed. This whole idea of saving face was huge. So after the war, the report gets published as a book. And its impact, especially inside Japan itself, was, it was nothing short of explosive.
How explosive? How about 2.3 times a million copies sold in Japan not long after it was translated? And the wildest part? Many Japanese people at the time read it and felt it was a shockingly accurate picture of their own culture, all written by a foreigner who had never even been there.
But, the book's reception wasn't set in stone. It changed a lot over time. What was first celebrated as this brilliant insight was later challenged, especially as Japan's post-war economy and identity started to grow and shift.
Yeah, critics started to argue that it just flattened a really complex and changing society into a simple stereotype. And they rightly pointed out that no culture is purely shame or purely guilt. And of course, trying to analyze an entire nation from thousands of miles away during a war, that's always going to have its limits.
But despite all the valid criticisms, the book is still this powerful testament to the attempt to bridge a massive cultural divide, especially in a time of crisis. And it really leaves us with this one last big, provocative question.
It's a pretty stark reminder, isn't it? That one book, an idea born from the need to understand an enemy, can end up defining how the whole world sees a nation for generations to come.
Welcome to The Explainer. So get this, in the middle of a world war, a government commissions a book, not to plan military strategy, but to try and decode the entire soul of its enemy.
During World War II, the U.S. was looking at Japan and was just completely stumped. The culture seemed like a walking contradiction. On the one hand, you have the chrysanthemum, this powerful symbol of beauty, art, and incredible gentleness, and on the other hand, the sword, representing a fierce, proud, martial tradition. How could they be the same people? Well, this explainer is all about the classic study that tried to solve that puzzle, the chrysanthemum and the sword.
So, that was the central question, right? How could one culture be so beautifully aesthetic and yet so brutally martial? So polite and yet also so arrogant, so submissive to all kinds of rules, but at the same time so unwilling to ever be subjugated by an enemy. It was a paradox that desperately needed an answer.
And the author, an anthropologist named Ruth Benedict, she just nailed the problem with this very quote. To figure this out, she argued, you just can't use a Western yardstick. It won't work. You have to throw it out completely and try to understand the world based on a totally different set of rules.
Okay, so where do we even begin with a puzzle like that? Well, according to the book's analysis, the first master key, the thing that unlocks everything else, is this core concept of a strict, accepted hierarchy, where every single person has their proper place.
And we're not just talking about high class versus low class here. No. This goes way deeper. It applies to every relationship in your life. Your place relative to your parents, your boss, your older siblings, even to the emperor himself. Knowing your exact spot in this intricate web and acting the right way, that was the absolute bedrock of the society she described. And you can see this principle in action in some really fascinating ways, like traditional inheritance. Unlike in China or Korea, the Japanese system she describes didn't just split the wealth or automatically give it to the eldest son. Nope, everything was passed down to a single, most capable heir. And get this, that person didn't even have to be a blood relative. They could be adopted for the role. What does that do? It creates intense competition and constantly reinforces that rigid social order. Okay, so if hierarchy is the skeleton, the social structure, what's the lifeblood that runs through its veins? What makes it all work? The answer, as the book frames it, is this incredibly complex system of social obligations. You could almost think of it as a lifetime of debt. At the very heart of this system is a concept called on. Now, it's really important not to just translate this as kindness. It's so much bigger than that. Think of it more like a fundamental cosmic debt you take on just by being born. You carry this weight from your parents, from your ancestors, from the emperor, and here's the kicker. It can never, ever be fully paid back. So this huge foundational debt, on, it gets broken down into two main accounts on your social ledger, and they basically guide your whole life. First, you've got Gimu. These are the infinite obligations, the debt to the emperor and your parents that you work on your whole life but can never clear. Then there's Giri. Think of these more like debts that must be repaid with almost mathematical precision. A favor for a favor. Fulfilling your Giri is absolutely essential for keeping your honor and your place in the world.
All right, so you've got this rigid structure and this insane web of social debts. But what actually motivates people to constantly manage all of this, to stay in line? What's the engine driving the whole machine?
And this slide right here illustrates probably the book's most famous and, let's be honest, most controversial idea. Benedict proposes this fundamental split between a guilt culture, which she identified with the West, and a shame culture. In a guilt culture, your behavior is policed by an internal compass, your conscience. You do something wrong, and you feel bad. But in a shame culture, the main driver is an external mirror, the judgment of other people. You do something wrong, and you look bad to everyone else.
So think about what that means. The ultimate social disaster isn't doing something wrong in private. The real catastrophe is having that wrongdoing exposed to the world. That exposure brings shame not just on you, but on your entire family, your entire community. And this explains so much of that paradox we started with. Extreme politeness becomes a shield to avoid causing offense and inviting shame, while a public insult demands an equally extreme aggressive response to wipe the slate clean and restore honor.
Now, all of these different threads we've been following, the rigid hierarchy, the lifelong debt of anamatsu, the incredible power of shame, they all spiral up and culminate in one single figure, the emperor.
What's so wild about the emperor's role in history is that for literally 1,000 years, he held immense symbolic importance, but had next to no actual political power. None. The real power was with the military leaders, the shoguns. The emperor was this sacred, untouchable figurehead, but he wasn't running the show. In fact, for centuries, trying to show loyalty directly to the emperor could get you in big trouble with the shogun. This separation of symbolic versus practical power is just a totally unique feature of the system.
So you see how he becomes the keystone holding the entire arch together. He's at the absolute peak of the hierarchy. He is the ultimate object of Jumu, that infinite, unrepayable debt. His sacred status is the final justification for the entire social order. And by being above politics, he acted as a stable, unchanging center of gravity, even as the real rulers, the shoguns, rose and fell over the centuries.
Look, the chrysanthemum in the sword was without a doubt a product of its time. It was written from a distance, without any actual fieldwork, and it's definitely had its fair share of criticism over the years. But its central lesson? Man, that's as powerful as ever. To truly understand a culture that seems like a total contradiction, you have to first be willing to set aside your own definitions of what's logical or moral. You have to at least try to see the world through their eyes. And that really makes you wonder, in our hyper-connected world today, are we getting any better at doing that?